It's Spritzy! Who's that Pokémon? It's Froakie! Who's that Pokémon? It's Fletchling! Who's that Pokémon? It's Dedenne! Who's that Pokémon? It's Vivian! Who's that Pokémon? It's Noivern! Who's that Pokémon? It's Fennekin! Who's that Pokémon? It's Furfrou! Who's that Pokémon? It's Heliolisk! Who's that Pokémon? It's Jaspin! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pancham! Who's that Pokémon? It's Scatterbug! Who's that Pokémon? It's Sylveon! Who's that Pokémon? It's Esper! Who's that Pokémon? It's Delphox! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pichu! Who's that Pokémon? It's Frogadier! Who's that Pokémon? It's Snorlax! Who's that Pokémon? It's Malamar! Who's that Pokémon? It's Fletchinder! Who's that Pokémon? It's Buttlebee! Who's that Pokémon? It's Clauncher! Who's that Pokémon? It's Amora! Who's that Pokémon? It's Tyrant! Who's that Pokémon? It's Slurpuff! Who's that Pokémon? It's Flabébé! Pokémon? It's Gardevoir!
Gardevoir.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Inkay! Renka! Who's that Pokémon? It's Lucario! Who's that Pokémon? It's Blaziken!
Blaziken!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Wigglytuff! Who's that Pokémon? It's Noibat! Who's that Pokémon? It's Mawile! Who's that Pokémon? It's Hawlucha!
Holuta!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Talonflame! Who's that Pokémon? It's Wobbuffet! Wobbuffet! Who's that Pokémon? It's Trevenant!
Trevenant.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Squirtle! Squirtle! Who's that Pokémon? It's Bulbasaur! Bulbasaur! Who's that Pokémon? It's Charmander! Charmander! Who's that Pokémon? It's Meowth! That's right! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pumpkaboo! Pumpkaboo! Who's that Pokémon? It's Mienfoo! Mienfoo! Who's that Pokémon? It's Meowstic! Meowstic! Who's that Pokémon? It's Salamence! Who's that Pokémon? It's Braixen! Who's that Pokémon? It's Luxio! Luxio! Who's that Pokémon? It's Lapras! Who's that Pokémon? It's Smoochum! Smoochum! Who's that Pokémon? It's Scrope! Scrope! Who's that Pokémon? It's Snubbull! Snubbull! Who's that Pokémon? medical?
Medical.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Skidoo! Skidoo! Who's that Pokémon? It's Bidoof! Bidoof! Who's that Pokémon? It's Gooey! Who's that Pokémon? It's Lotad! Lotad! Who's that Pokémon? It's Vanillite! Who's that Pokémon? It's Jumpluff! Jumpluff! Who's that Pokémon? It's Dunsparce!
Dunsparce.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Klefki! Klefki! Who's that Pokémon? It's Spoink! Spoink! Who's that Pokémon? It's Luxray!
Luxray.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Wynot! Wynot! Who's that Pokémon? It's Trico! Trico! Who's that Pokémon? It's Sliggoo!
Sliggy.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Magneton! Magneton! Who's that Pokémon? It's Goodra! Who's that Pokémon? It's Garchomp! Who's that Pokémon? It's Wooper! Who's that Pokémon? It's Florges! Florges! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pangoro!
Pangoro.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Ghastly!
Ghastly.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Bagon!
Bagon.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Mr. Mime! Mime! Who's that Pokémon? It's Grovyle! Who's that Pokémon? It's Altaria! Altaria! Who's that Pokémon? It's not Pokémon? It's Bustle and Minun. Who's that Pokémon? It's Rotom. Who's that Pokémon? It's Gorgeist.
More guys.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Abomasnow.
Abomasnow.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Jigglypuff. Jigglypuff. Who's that Pokémon? It's Gallade.
Gallade.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Charmeleon.
Char.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Tyrantrum.
Tyrantrum.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Trubbish. Trubbish. Who's that Pokémon? It's Eevee. Eevee. Who's that Pokémon? It's Ivysaur.
Ivysaur.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Gloom. Who's that Pokémon? It's Sableye.
Sableye.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Sigilif.
Sigilif.
Who's that Pokémon? It's, Squishy! Who's that Pokémon? It's Quilladin!
Quilladin.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Audino! Audino! Who's that Pokémon? It's Litleo! Who's that Pokémon? It's Darkrai! Who's that Pokémon? It's Venusaur!
Venusaur.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Greninja! Greninja! Who's that Pokémon? It's Gothita! Gothita! Who's that Pokémon? It's Drapion!
Tour.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Toxicroak!
Toxic.
Who's that Pokémon? It's Floette! Who's that Pokémon? Pokémon? It's Persian! Who's that Pokémon? It's Chestnut!
Chestnut!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Espeon! Who's that Pokémon? It's Zapdos! Who's that Pokémon? It's Barnacle!
Binacle!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Scraggy!
Scraggy!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Aromatisse! Who's that Pokémon? It's Bonnieri! Who's that Pokémon? It's Curlia! Who's that Pokémon? It's Metang!
Mature!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Phantom! Who's that Pokémon? It's Diglett! Who's that Pokémon? It's Doublade!
Double!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Bergmite! Who's that Pokémon? It's Oddish! Who's that Pokémon? It's Avalo! Who's that Pokémon? It's Carbink! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pinsir! Who's that Pokémon? It's Charizard! Who's that Pokémon? It's Aegislash! Who's that Pokémon? It's Slacking!
Slacky!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Salamence!
Wow!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Sceptile!
Sceptile!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Metagross!
Mature!
Who's that Pokémon? It's Bisharp!
Bizarre!
Who's that Pokémon? It's It's Zygarde, 10% form! Who's that Pokémon? It's Zygarde, 50% form! Who's that Pokémon? It's Crobat! Who's that Pokémon? It's Weavile! Who's that Pokémon? It's Houndoom! Who's that Pokémon? It's Psyduck! Who's that Pokémon? It's Hoppip! Who's that Pokémon? It's Zygarde, complete form! Who's that Pokémon? It's Pikachu! Who's that Pokémon? It's Yveltal!